The storm hit Graving Pass on the first night of real winter, and Aldrich Marsh felt it coming an hour before the snow did, felt it in the way the mountain went quiet, the way the wind dropped to nothing and held its breath. He had lived at the pass long enough to read those silences. He banked the workshop stove, moved his most delicate pieces away from the draft gap under the east wall, and brought in an extra armload of wood. Then he lit the lamp above his door the way he always did in bad weather, because Graving was the only crossing for 40 miles in either direction, and sometimes travelers came through who needed to see a light. He did not expect anyone that night. The road had been empty since midday. He was at his bench, working a stubborn pivot housing back to true with a burnishing rod, when the knock came, not a strong knock, but not a tentative one either. The kind of knock a person makes when they are concentrating very hard on not falling down. Aldrich set his magnifying lens aside, crossed the workshop in 4 steps, and opened the door. She was enormous. That was the first thing he registered, the sheer height of her, the breadth of her shoulders, the way she had to tilt her head slightly just to fit the frame of his doorway without touching it. She was an orc woman, green-skinned and dark, with 2 thick braids plastered against her neck by wet snow and a traveling cloak so soaked it had stopped being useful some time ago. She had one hand braced against the doorframe. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, amber-brown, steady, looked at him the way a person looks at something they are not entirely sure they deserve. There was a cut along her left forearm, not deep but not clean either, wrapped in a strip of cloth that had long since gone dark with cold and weather. She said nothing for a moment. The snow blew sideways behind her. Then, "I saw your lamp." Aldrich looked at her. He looked at the storm behind her, at the empty road, at the dark shapes of the trees bent sideways in the wind. He looked at the cut on her arm. Then he looked at her face, the steadiness of it, the wariness, the particular quality of a person who is braced for refusal. "Come in," he said. She hesitated just for a breath, as if she needed to hear it again before she believed it, and then she stepped inside. He did not ask her name that night. He did not ask what had happened to her arm, or who had given her that wound, or why a woman of her bearing was crossing Graving Pass alone in a winter storm without so much as a pack horse or a saddlebag. He put water on for tea. He set a second cup on the table, and he went to the shelf where he kept his medical supplies, the clean linen, the drawing salve, the needle and gut he used for the occasional traveler who came through in worse shape than she was. He set them on the table beside the cups, and then he went back to his bench. "You can use what's there," he said. "The bandage will need to be changed. Water's almost hot." She stood in the middle of the workshop for a moment, looking at the table, looking at the supplies he'd set out, and then at him, and then back at the supplies. Her expression was complicated in a way he did not try to read. Then she sat down, unwrapped the cloth from her arm with careful hands, and began to clean the wound herself. She was systematic about it, efficient, unfrightened by her own blood, and Aldrich watched her briefly from the corner of his eye and thought that she had done this before. Not recently enough to be casual about it, but often enough to know the steps. He made the tea. He set her cup beside her without comment. She looked at it for a moment, then wrapped her hands around it and held it, and some of the cold went out of her shoulders. Outside, the storm found its full voice, and the windows shook in their frames, and the stove ticked and popped, and neither of them said a word for a long time. Aldrich's workshop was small. 2 long benches ran along opposing walls, covered in the usual organized disorder of his work, clock gears and spring housings, tiny screws sorted by size into shallow dishes, the skeletal frames of mechanisms waiting to be filled. Tools hung above the benches in rows, each in its proper bracket, a habit drilled into him by his teacher 20 years ago and never once abandoned. The back wall was shelving, complete pieces waiting for collection, parts cataloged in paper-wrapped bundles, the ledger of orders going back 6 years. His living quarters were through the door at the far end, one room with a stove, a table, and the bed he'd been sleeping in alone for 4 years, since the fever took Marit the spring before their daughter would have been born. It was a small life. It was an honest one. He did not spend much time arguing with it. The orc woman finished wrapping her arm with the clean linen. She wound it neatly, tied it off with a knot that held without being tight, and set the spare strip of cloth on the table with the same precision she had used for everything else. Then, for the first time, she looked around the workshop properly. Not the wary look of a moment ago, this was something else. Her gaze moved across the benches, the tools, the suspended innards of a grandfather clock he was in the middle of rebuilding, the rows of completed pieces on the back shelf, and her expression changed in a way he didn't entirely catch. Something quieted in her face. Something that had been braced came down a fraction. "You make things," she said. "Fix them mostly," Aldrich said. "Some making." She nodded once slowly, as though that answer meant something to her. "Is there somewhere I can sleep?" she asked. "I won't trouble you past morning." He put her in the workshop itself. There was a cot in the back corner he kept for long nights, and he went through to his own room and lay down in his clothes and listened to the storm say everything there was to say about the mountain in winter, and in the morning he was up before light making porridge. She was already awake when he came through, sitting on the cot, braids redone with the patient neatness of someone who considered this a non-negotiable start to the day, traveling cloak hanging over a chair by the stove where it had dried overnight. She had not touched anything on the benches. Aldrich noted that. He set the pot on the table and 2 bowls beside it and sat down. They ate. The storm had moved on in the night, and the pass outside was buried in new snow, pristine and still. The mountain had that particular hush it kept after a heavy snowfall, as if it had said everything it had to say and was now waiting to see what you would do about it. "The road to Ashenveld will be drifted," he said. "Could be 2 days before the post rider comes through to break the North Trail." She looked out the window. He could see her weighing it, whatever it was she was weighing, the wound on her arm, the snow on the road, the passes behind her and the passes ahead, and whatever waited at either end. She had the look of a person solving a problem with variables she was not ready to name. "I can give you the cot another night," he said, "or 2. It's no trouble." She looked at him then, a long, measuring look that he did not find uncomfortable. He was used to people looking at him that way when he was being straightforward about something. After a moment, something in her face settled. "My name is Sora," she said. "Aldrich," he said. She nodded. "Thank you, Aldrich." That was the beginning of it. The North Trail stayed drifted for 4 days, not 2. On the 3rd morning Sora appeared at the workshop door. She had been sleeping and taking meals but otherwise staying out of his way, a consideration he appreciated, and said, without preamble, "You have a backlog." He did. 3 clock mechanisms waiting to be regulated, a commissioned music box with a broken cam, 2 sets of gears that needed cleaning and re-oiling, a barometer a merchant from Ashenveld had left for repair before the first snow fell, and half a dozen smaller items in various states of disassembly. None of it was urgent. All of it was waiting. "I can see what needs sorting," she said, "if you'll show me." He showed her. She was careful and attentive and asked good questions, and she had a quality he valued above almost everything else in a workshop. She did not rush. She understood without being told that small things wanted patience. She picked up pieces with the right amount of firmness, not tentative, not careless, and when she asked what something was, she listened to the full answer before asking the next question. By the end of the 2nd day, she was cleaning and cataloging his spare parts with a thoroughness that made him feel faintly embarrassed about how long he'd let it slide. She found 3 sets of duplicate stock, 2 misfiles, and 1 gear he had spent 4 days looking for 6 months ago. On the 5th day, when the post rider finally broke the North Trail and a traveler or 2 came through, Aldrich stood at the workshop door and watched the road and noticed that Sora did not. She went very still when she heard the horse on the path, and she moved not quickly, but deliberately, away from the window and deeper into the workshop, occupying herself intently with the parts inventory until the sound of hoofbeats had passed and the road was empty again. He didn't say anything about that either. On the sixth morning, she came to breakfast with something in her hands. She set it on the table between the bowls. It was a compass, or it had been once. The brass casing was intact but badly dented on one side, as though it had been stepped on or struck against stone, and when he picked it up and opened the cover he could see that the needle was broken, sheared off at the pivot, the mechanism inside bent out of true. The glass was cracked clean through, a single fracture running diagonally from edge to center, and the whole instrument listed slightly when he held it level, the way a thing does when something internal has shifted from where it was meant to be. "Can you fix it?" she asked. He turned it over in his hands. Old work, very old, he thought, older than anything he'd made or repaired in recent years. The brass was engraved on the back with a mountain symbol and a line of characters in a script he couldn't read, worn smooth at the edges from long handling. There was a solidity to the piece, even damaged, that spoke of original craft that had been exceptional. Whoever had made this had made it to last. Whoever had carried it for a generation, maybe more. "Where did it come from?" he asked. A brief pause. "My father," she said. He looked at the case again, at the engraving, at the quality of the original work under the damage. Then he looked at her. "I can fix it," he said. "It'll take time. The needle housing is bent, I'll need to work it back by degrees, and then I'll need to make a new needle entirely. The glass will need to be replaced as well. I have stock that might fit, but I'll need to measure the diameter before I can order." He turned the compass over once more. "I won't rush it." "Whatever it costs," she said. "Let's see if I can do it first," Aldrich said. "Then we'll talk about cost." He set the compass on his primary bench, directly under the lamp with the best glass, and the following morning he began. It took him 12 days. Not because the work was beyond him. It was not, but because the work demanded the kind of attention that could not be hurried without damaging what you were trying to repair. The pivot housing had been struck with enough force to compress the brass inward unevenly, and he had to work it back by degrees, heating the metal with a small torch, letting it reach the right temperature, then easing it outward a fraction at a time with a series of progressively finer tools. Too much force and the brass would crack. Too little and the housing would not come true. He spent 2 full days on this stage alone, stopping often, remeasuring, holding the case under the lamp to check the progress of the correction from every angle. He made a new pivot needle from a rod of tempered steel he had in stock, ground it to the right gauge on his wheel, polished the tip to reduce friction, and balanced it with a counterweight no larger than a grain of rice. The replacement glass he ordered through the post when the rider came through again, specifying the diameter and the thickness to the nearest ½ millimeter, because the compass deserved precision, and while he waited for it to arrive, he cleaned the rest of the mechanism part by part, cataloging what was damaged and what was merely worn, replacing the small return spring and the locking catch on the cover, polishing the brass inside the case to the kind of clean that let the new work sit properly. Sora watched him work. Not constantly, she had her own work in the workshop by then, had taken on the task of recataloguing his entire parts inventory with a systematic thoroughness that was beginning to transform the secondary bench from a productive chaos into something closer to a library. But often, she would come and stand at his elbow in the particular way that meant she was watching to understand something, not just to watch, and sometimes she would ask a question about what he was doing and why, and his answers would be patient and specific because that was how he talked about work he cared about. She was easy to talk to. That surprised him a little. She was a quiet person, not cold, just economical, a person who had learned to measure what she said and did not spend words she didn't have to spend. But when she spoke, what she said was worth listening to, and when she listened, she was fully present in a way that Aldrich found uncommon and valuable. She didn't fill silences to fill them. He could work beside her for an hour without either of them speaking, and the silence would be the productive kind, the kind that had work in it. The valley talked. He knew it would. Graven was a small community, a trading post, 3 farmsteads, a waystation inn, and his workshop, and an orc woman staying at the tinker's house was exactly the kind of thing people noticed and discussed. He heard it from the post rider, who mentioned with great casualness that folks down in Ashenveld had been asking whether he'd seen any unusual travelers come through the pass. He heard it in the slightly longer pause the innkeeper's wife took before she answered his greeting when he came to collect a package. He heard it most directly from old Fenwick, the farmstead nearest the road, who stopped by on a thin pretext one afternoon and spent 20 minutes trying to find a comfortable way to say what he'd come to say. "She's no trouble," Aldrich said, when Fenwick had finished navigating around the point. "She's been helping with the backlog." "It's not that," Fenwick said. He picked up a clock wheel from the table, examined it without seeing it, set it back down with the care of someone who did not want to break anything. "There's been men through. Riders, couple nights back, came through after dark and didn't stop at the inn, went up toward the high trail. Asking about an orc woman. Description was general enough, but not so general you'd miss it." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "What kind of men?" he said. Fenwick shrugged, but not easily. "Clan riders is what they looked like. Hard ones, though, the kind that ride like they've been riding a long time and don't particularly care who knows it. Mountain clan colors would be my guess, but different from the regular trade riders. Paid well for information, people said. Too well." After Fenwick left, Aldrich sat at the bench for a while without working. Then he went through to the back room, where Sora was finishing the last section of the parts inventory, and he stood in the doorway. "You know," he said carefully, "if there was something you needed me to know, so I could be useful about it, I'd listen." She didn't look up from the ledger immediately. The pen moved in a precise line, finishing the entry she was on. Then she set it down. "I was accused," she said, "by someone who wanted me gone. The accusation is false. The truth will come out or it won't, that's out of my hands now. But until it does, it's better for me to be nowhere in particular." A pause. "And better for the people around me to know as little as possible." "That last part's not yours to decide," Aldrich said. "Not for me, at least." She looked at him then. The same measuring look she'd given him on that first morning, except longer and quieter. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." He went back to the compass. The replacement glass arrived on the next post day, wrapped in layers of felt against the cold in the road. He fitted it that evening, working by lamplight while the wind made its presence known on the roof of the workshop in the way wind did at Graving, not aggressively, just persistently, a reminder that the mountain was still there. The glass was a fraction thicker than the original but ground to exactly the right diameter, and it seated cleanly in the case with a satisfying solidity. He set the new needle on the freshly aligned pivot, tested the balance, adjusted the counterweight once, tested again. He closed the cover, held the compass level, and opened the cover one final time. The needle swung, hesitated for a fraction of a second, while the balance found itself and pointed north. He set it on the bench in front of the lamp and went to find Sora. She was in the living room, sitting at his table with a book she'd found on his shelf, one of Merritt's, a collection of mountain folktales his wife had loved and read so many times the spine was soft. She was reading with the particular stillness of someone who had not had quiet time with a book in a long while, and she did not notice him immediately. When she looked up, he said only, "It's done." She came to the workshop and he stood back and let her pick the compass up herself. She held it as he had, level, steady, and opened the cover with her thumbnail. The needle swung and settled. She held it for a long moment, watching the needle's stillness, and the expression on her face was not one he would easily forget. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. Something that had to do with the engraving on the back of the case and the weight of the piece in her hands and the fact that it was whole again, the way it was supposed to be, the way it had been in her father's hands before it had been in hers. "What do I owe you?" she said when she had held it long enough. "Whatever you think is fair," Aldrich said. "You've more than covered your room and board and workshop help." She looked at him. He thought she might push back on that, recalculate the accounting on her own terms. But instead she just nodded once, and held the compass a moment longer before she tucked it carefully inside her vest, against her chest, close to her heart. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she told him a little. Not everything, she was still careful, still measured with what she said, and he understood that some of it was not hers alone to tell. But a little. She told him she had grown up in mountains not unlike these, and that her father was a man she respected above all others, and that she had been trying to reach him for 3 months. She told him that the compass was the only thing of his she had with her, and that she had been carrying it since the night she left. She told him that she had spent a long time learning to fix things herself, mechanisms, disputes, situations that had come apart, and that it had surprised her, genuinely, to watch someone else do it with so little noise and so little interest in credit. He listened. He told her in turn a little about Merritt, about the life they had planned together that had contracted to this, the workshop, the pass, the lamp above the door, and the work that kept the hands busy when the evenings were long. He told it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way he told most things. She listened without trying to fix it, which he appreciated more than she probably knew. Outside, the mountain was cold and bright and enormous, and the stars over Graven were the kind you only saw at altitude, each one sharp as a point of ground steel, so close they seemed like something you could reach up and interfere with if you were foolish enough to try. The weeks shaped themselves around a routine. Aldrich worked. Sara worked alongside him. They ate together in the mornings and evenings and exchanged what conversation arose naturally, without manufacturing it. She was a quick study at everything she turned her hand to, not just the sorting and cataloging but the work itself. She had a feel for mechanisms, for the logic of small moving things, that he would not have expected from someone who'd learned it only by watching. He found himself explaining more than he usually did, because her questions were good, and good questions sharpened his own thinking in a way that solitary work sometimes didn't. He did not ask her who she really was. He knew that the shape of her, the quality of her bearing, the way she had wrapped her arm that first night with the economy of someone trained in field care, the script on the compass case and the weight of that piece in her hands, added up to something more than an ordinary traveler. But it was her story to tell, and she was telling it at the pace she was ready for, and he had not survived 4 years alone at Graven by being impatient with silences or with people. The valley's wariness settled by degrees into something like a cautious peace. Old Fenwick stopped by twice more, once to ask about a broken harness fitting, which Aldrich repaired in 10 minutes while Sara showed Fenwick the newly organized parts inventory without being asked to, because she had correctly identified that Fenwick was the kind of person who relaxed when he had something useful to look at. The innkeeper's wife sent her nephew down with a clock mechanism that had been giving trouble for a year, and when Sara looked it over alongside Aldrich and the two of them found the fault in under an hour, the nephew carried back a report that seemed to count for something in the valley's ongoing ledger of opinion. The riders Fenwick had mentioned did not return. Aldrich did not fully relax about that, but the days passed without incident, and the snow kept falling, and the pass stayed difficult enough to discourage hard travel, and the life of the workshop went on. One afternoon, near the end of the second month, Sara found the music box. It had been sitting in its state of disassembly on the secondary bench since before she'd arrived, the commission piece, the one with the broken cam, which he hadn't gotten to because the cam required making a specialized tool first, and he kept putting off the tool. She looked at it for a while, turning the broken cam over in her hands, then looked at his tool rack, then picked up a piece of bar stock and held it at different angles with the expression she wore when she was working something out. "The cam follower spring is what you need made, yes," she said, "and a template to cut the replacement cam profile accurately." "That's it," he said. She thought about it for another moment, set the bar stock down, picked up a different piece, and went to the bench. She got it right on the second attempt. The first version was close but not quite the right profile. She could see it herself when she held it against the broken cam before he said a word, and she adjusted her calculations and cut a new one with the quiet finality of a person correcting their own error without drama. When she offered the second version and he tested it against the mechanism, it fit. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I watched you." He turned back to the bench, because he didn't entirely trust his face just then. The music box was finished by the end of the week. When he wound the key and the mechanism turned and the melody began, a clean, ringing mountain air, 12 notes looping back on themselves in a pattern that was simple and lovely. She stood and listened to it with the same quiet attention she gave to everything that worked the way it was supposed to. Something in her expression, just at the corners of her eyes, was very nearly a smile. "It's good," she said. "It always was," he said. "It just needed the right piece." She looked at him, then in a way that might have been about more than the music box, but he returned his attention to the workbench, because he was not a man who gathered meanings that hadn't been offered plainly. It was early on the morning of the 53rd day. Aldrich kept a count without entirely meaning to, the way you count without meaning to things that feel like they have a natural number. When he heard a horse come up the pass at a pace that was not a traveler's pace. He was at the bench working through the first of the clock mechanisms on the backlog. Sara was at the secondary bench sorting a tray of spring stock by gauge. When the sound reached her, she went still in a way he had not seen her go still before, not the wary still of the early weeks, when any sound on the road made her careful. This was a different quality of stillness, a listening still, head slightly tilted, hands quiet on the tray. "That's not a post rider," she said. "No," Aldrich said. The hoofbeats slowed at the gate. Aldrich stood, wiped his hands on his apron, and went to the window. He could see a rider at the gate, an older figure, heavy-set, wrapped in a heavy traveling coat with a clan badge at the collar that caught the morning light. Mountain clan colors, certainly, but not the hard-faced riders Fenwick had described. This was a different kind of man entirely. The kind of man who had ridden hard for weeks, not because someone had ordered him to, but because he was looking for something that mattered. The rider was looking at the workshop, looking at it with an attention that went beyond reading the sign. Sara had come to stand beside him. He could feel the change in her before he saw it on her face, the way a room feels different when a window is opened on a clear day. Then Aldrich watched it happen clearly. The rider's whole bearing changed. He sat up straighter in the saddle. Something that had been tight in his posture released. His hand, which had been resting on the pommel, dropped to his side. He was looking at Sara through the workshop window with the look of a man who has been searching for a long time and has just stopped. Sara made a sound that was barely a sound at all, a single released breath. "That's Elder Havath," she said, very quietly. "He's my father's voice." The elder dismounted at the gate. He moved like a man who had been a great deal in the saddle recently, and was carrying the weight of those miles in his joints, carefully, with the particular stiffness that told you more about the journey than about the man's age. When he was on the ground, he stood for a moment with both hands on the gate post, looking at the workshop. Then he came through the gate and walked up the path. Aldrich went and opened the door. Havath looked at him briefly, long enough to take stock, and with the kind of look that was accustomed to taking stock quickly and accurately, and then looked past him at Sara. When he spoke, it was in the clan tongue, low and rapid, and Aldrich stepped back to give them the doorway and went to the stove to put water on. It was, he had found over the years, always the right thing to do. The conversation at the door went on for some time. He caught none of the words. The mountain clan tongue was not his, and he had not tried to learn more than the dozen words that came from trading with clan travelers, but he caught the shape of it. Urgent first, then steadying, then something that sounded like relief so profound it had physical weight, the kind that made you want to sit down. At one point Sora's voice rose briefly, not in anger but in something that might have been disbelief, and then settled. At one point there was a silence that lasted long enough that Aldrich checked that the water was still on. Then Sora appeared in the doorway to the living room. Her face was very composed and very unguarded at the same time, which he had come to understand was how she looked when something mattered a great deal. "Aldrich," her voice was steady, "will you sit with us?" He sat. He brought the tea. Haveth sat across from him at the small table and looked at him with the same careful attention he had brought to the doorway, and after a moment he addressed Sora in the clan tongue, a question, and Sora answered it, and Haveth nodded. "He wants to know who you are," Sora said. "A tinker," Aldrich said. "My name's Aldrich Marsh, I fix things." Sora translated. Haveth's eyes stayed on Aldrich. "He wants to know what you knew about me, and why you let me stay." Aldrich thought about it for a moment, genuinely. "I didn't need to know," he said. "She was cold and the storm was bad and she needed a place to be for a while, that's all." When Sora translated this, Haveth was still for a long moment. Then he looked at Sora and said something short, 2 or 3 words, with a quietness that gave the words weight. Something complex moved through Sora's expression. "He says," she said carefully, "that my father would want to hear this told to him directly." That was how Aldrich learned who she was. Not all at once. Haveth spoke carefully and Sora translated, and there were things she summarized, and things she filled in quietly over the next hour, until the shape of it was clear. Sora was the eldest daughter of Chief Arden of the Mountain Clan, heir to a position of considerable standing and responsibility. She had been falsely accused of conspiring with a rival faction within the clan to unseat her father, an accusation fabricated by that same faction to remove her before she could expose what they were doing. She had fled ahead of their action against her, making her way toward a trusted allies holding 3 valleys over, when she had been attacked on the mountain road, outriders of the faction, 2 of them, which explained the arm. She had been separated from her escort in the aftermath, and then the storm had caught her, and then she had seen the lamp. The accusation had begun to unravel within a month. Haveth had found the evidence her father needed. The faction's leaders were under confinement now, their actions before the full clan council. Her name had been cleared in the council's judgment, had been cleared for 6 weeks in fact, while Haveth had searched for her across half the mountain range, following the cold trail of a woman who had been very careful about not being found. She was free, had been free for more than a month without knowing it. Aldrich listened to all of this. He refilled the tea. He thought about the compass in her vest, the measured way she'd said "my father" when she set it on the table, the manner in which she'd gone still when hoofbeats came up the pass. He thought about the cam follower cut right on the second attempt, the way she'd listened to his answers and then asked the next question that mattered. He thought about all of it settling into a different order, making a different shape. When Haveth had finished, Aldrich looked at Sora. "Your father must be worried," he said. "Yes," she said. Something in her expression held a question he didn't entirely know how to read yet. "Then you should go to him," Aldrich said. She was quiet for a moment, then Haveth came alone. "It will take a day to send word and another 2 days for an escort to reach the pass." A pause that was not quite a question. "If your offer of the cot still stands." "It stands," Aldrich said. He stood and picked up the tea things. "I'll make up a room for the elder as well. There's a spare cot in the storage." It was 3 more days. Haveth used them to rest, which he plainly needed in the serious, bone-deep way of someone who has been pushing past what the body was willing to offer. He was a man of 60 or so who had been riding mountain passes for 6 weeks in winter on the strength of not giving up, and the weariness sat in him down to the bone. He ate well, slept long, and spent the daylight hours sitting by the workshop stove with a quietness that Aldrich found congenial. They could not speak directly, neither had enough of the other's tongue, but a man who sits peacefully by your stove and does not make demands of the space is easy company, and Aldrich found he did not mind. On the second day Haveth asked, through Sora's translation, to see the compass. Aldrich took it from the bench where Sora had set it when she came in. She had taken it out and placed it there without explanation, and Aldrich had understood this as a kind of statement, a return of it to the light, and he showed the elder the work. The new pivot needle, the replacement glass fitted to the original diameter, the reworked housing, the cleaned mechanism, the restored spring catch. Haveth examined the compass with great care, turning it in his large hands, opening and closing the cover, holding it level and watching the needle settle. Then he said something brief and quiet. "He says," Sora translated, "that my grandfather made this compass, that it has been in my family for 3 generations, and that you did well by it." Aldrich said it was a fine piece and had been worth the care. Haveth nodded in the way of a man who had expected exactly that answer. Sora spent those 3 days working alongside Aldrich as she had for the past 7 weeks, and yet differently, with a lightness in her now that had not been there before, a loosening of something that had been held carefully taut for a very long time. She laughed twice, properly, once at a small error she made measuring a gear clearance, and once at something Haveth said from his chair that she translated for Aldrich as, "He says your workshop is the tidiest he has seen since a man who had been in prison for 12 years and used the time productively." Aldrich considered this for a moment, and then decided to take it as a compliment. On the morning of the 4th day, Aldrich heard the horses from some distance off. Not 1 or 2, many horses, moving together in that particular rhythm that carried across the mountain quiet even at distance, a sound like the land itself reorganizing its weight. He went to the window. They came up the pass road in a column that stretched back out of sight around the lower bend. Mountain clan riders at the front, 24 of them in good order, and behind them more, and behind those more still, until the road was filled with them from the bend to the gate, and the air above the pass was white with their breath rising in the cold. They rode with clan banners furled against the wind. At the head of the column was a figure he could not yet see clearly, on a horse that moved with the deliberateness of a horse carrying someone who knows exactly where he is going. Sora appeared at his shoulder. She had known they were coming. Haveth had sent word 2 days ago, but knowing a thing and standing at a window watching it arrive are different experiences. She stood at the window beside Aldrich and watched the column come up the road, and the expression on her face was one he could read now, after 2 months of learning the vocabulary of it. The relief, yes, and the gladness, but also something more measured, more careful, the face of someone returning to the full weight of who they were after a long season of being allowed to simply be a person in a workshop fixing things. "That's a great many riders," Aldrich said. "My father does not travel lightly," she said. There was warmth in her voice when she said it. The column halted at the gate. The figure at its head dismounted, and when he did, every rider behind him dismounted as well, a single motion running back through the column like a wave. And the sound of it, the creak and stamp, the muffled gathered thunder of all those horses going still at once, settled over the pass like something ceremonial. Aldrich opened the workshop door and stepped out into the cold morning. Sora stepped out beside him. Chief Arden of the Mountain Clan was a large man even by Orc standards, massive-shouldered, gray at the temples of his dark hair, with his daughter's amber-brown eyes and something in his bearing that reminded Aldrich, oddly, of old Fenwick, a person who had been responsible for things for a very long time, and worn the weight of it so long it no longer seemed separate from him. He walked up the path from the gate to the workshop without hurry. Behind him, the riders stood at their horses' heads, still and quiet. When he reached the door, he stopped. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. They looked at each other the way two people look who have been a great deal worried about each other and are now required to hold themselves together until there is privacy enough to stop. Then he looked at Aldrich. He spoke. His voice was low and measured and carried a quality that needed no translation, but Sara translated anyway. He says my absence hurt him more than he would have expected for a man who believed he was finished being surprised by the things his children could do to him. Arden looked at Sara when she finished, and what was between them in that look was not for Aldrich, and he turned slightly away from it. He heard Sara say something in the clan tongue, 3 words, low and clear, the tone of them unmistakable even without translation, and heard Arden's answer, 1 word, rough at the edges in the way of a man who is managing himself carefully. Then Arden turned back to Aldrich. He reached into his coat and brought out a parcel wrapped in oiled canvas and held it out with both hands. Aldrich took it. When Arden spoke, Sara translated. He says that he owes you more than this can account for, and that he knows it, and that a debt that cannot be fully paid is still a debt that is owed. Aldrich looked at the parcel in his hands. He did not open it yet. Your daughter worked hard for her keep, he said. She overhauled my entire parts inventory, finished 3 pieces in the backlog, and designed a tool I'd been putting off making for 4 months. I got the better end of the arrangement. Sara translated. The corners of Arden's mouth moved. He spoke again. He says this does not surprise him in the least. Then the chief turned and spoke to the riders behind him, and there was a sound, not quite a cheer, not quite a salute, something with the weight of both, a deep sound from many throats at once that rolled up the pass and up the face of the mountain and came back as a softer echo from the heights, and all those riders stood straight and still with their hands at their chests. Aldrich stood at the door of his small stone workshop at Graven Pass with the parcel in his hands, and the mountain above him, and the morning light on the snow, and he let the sound settle over the house and the lamp above the door and the work on the bench inside, and he did not entirely know what to do with his face, so he did the thing he usually did when he didn't know what to do with his face, which was to look at the work. Haveth reappeared from inside with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done his job and was now ready to go home. The riders began to prepare to move the business of mounting and organizing a long column on a narrow mountain road, and the quarter hour of logistics that followed gave the moment room to breathe and settle before it ended. Sara came to stand beside Aldrich when the preparations were largely complete. I have to go, she said. I know, he said. She looked at the workshop, at the lamp above the door, at the window where his bench lamp made a yellow square of light. Then she looked at the pass road going down the mountain, the way she would go. The music box is finished, she said. The patron never came. He'll come in spring, Aldrich said. They always do. She nodded. Then she turned and looked at him directly, and in that look was all of it. The compass on the table that first morning, the evening's reading at his table, the cam follower cut right on the second try, the 12-note mountain air from the finished music box, the work done side by side in the good silence of a workshop where 2 people understood the same things about patience. The pass is necessary work, she said. It's a living, he said. It's more than that. She said it the way she said things she had thought about. She reached inside her vest and brought out the compass. She held it for a long moment, just a moment, and then she put it away again, and the gesture was a goodbye and a keeping and an agreement all at once, the kind that 2 careful people make without having to negotiate. Will you be here in spring? She said. I'll be here, he said. He was always here. That was the nature of the pass. She nodded once, held his gaze for a breath longer than she needed to, and then she turned and walked to her horse and mounted. She rode out of the gate and down the pass road without looking back, because she was the kind of person who said her goodbyes when she meant them and then kept going, and he respected that in a person. He stood at the workshop door and watched until the last rider had gone around the lower bend, and the sound of the column faded down the mountain, and then he went back inside. The workshop was quiet. It was always quiet. The stove was going, the lamp was lit, the bench was full of work. The music box was on the secondary bench under the window where the light was good for it. He sat down at the primary bench and opened the ledger and made a note. Then he looked at the parcel the chief had given him, sitting where he'd set it. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a mechanism, very old, older even than the compass. At first he took it for a clock movement, but when he held it under the lamp he saw it was something more. A navigation instrument, complex and layered, with nested wheels and a set of finely made indicators whose function he could not immediately account for. The original work was extraordinary. Some of the gears were worn. A spring was broken. 2 of the indicator arms needed work. It needed a tinker. He set it on the bench in front of the lamp and looked at it for a long time, the way he looked at new work, carefully, without hurry. Outside, the mountain held its silence. The lamp burned above the door. He got out his tools. He would not have said exactly when the thought arrived, whether it was that afternoon with the mechanism in his hands, or later in the deep weeks of the winter, or when the first thaw loosened the pass road and the travelers started coming through again. It arrived the way true things arrived, not as a revelation but as a recognition, the kind you don't argue with because it has already been true for some time and you are simply catching up to it. The house was quieter than it had been for the past 7 weeks. Not the empty quiet of the 4 years before she had come. He knew that quiet exactly, knew its particular texture, and this was not the same. This was the specific quiet of a space that had recently been full, that had good reasons to be full again, and was waiting with more patience than emptiness usually permits. The cot in the workshop corner was folded, but he had not moved it back to storage. The ledger showed the best organized parts inventory he had ever had. The repaired music box played its clean mountain air when he wound it. The cam follower tool she had made on the second attempt was on the secondary bench where she had left it, precisely where it belonged. He thought about the questions that sharpened his thinking. He thought about the sound of her laugh in the workshop, twice, properly, the kind of laugh you don't plan. He thought about the compass needle swinging to north and the look on her face when it steadied, and the way she'd said it's more than that about the work at the pass, the way she said things she had thought about. He kept the lamp above the door burning. Spring came to Graven Pass the way it always came, not with a rush but with a gradual relenting, the snow retreating by degrees up the mountain flanks, the road clearing from the bottom up, the pass remembering that it was a passage and not just a cold place to wait. The first post-riders of the new season arrived a week before the general traffic. The world remembered, one day at a time, that it was possible to move. On a morning in early spring, clear, cold, the sky above the pass the particular blue that came after the long white months like a statement, Aldrich heard a horse on the road. He was at the bench. The sound was a single horse, unhurried, moving with the certainty of someone who knew where they were going. He did not go to the window. The knock at the workshop door was direct and easy, the knock of someone who knows the door. He went and opened it. Sara stood at the door of his workshop with her dark braids settled after a morning's riding, and the mountain behind her, and the compass in her vest where it had been for 3 generations, and an expression on her face that was composed and unguarded at the same time, the look of a person who has made a decision clearly and is not second-guessing it. "I told my father," she said, "that I wanted to learn the trade properly, not as a courtesy, as a real apprenticeship." Aldrich looked at her. "He said," she continued, "that there is no better training than learning from a master, and that a well-made thing is its own argument for the maker." A pause. "He also said that the man who spent 12 days repairing his grandfather's compass, and then quietly fixed a navigation instrument he didn't even know the purpose of, was either the most presumptuous tinker in the mountains or the most perceptive one." I didn't know what it was, Aldrich said. I just saw it needed fixing. I told him that, Sora said. He said that is precisely what a master would say. Aldrich stood in the doorway for a moment. The morning light was doing what morning light did at Graven in spring, making everything look like an argument for being exactly where you were and having no particular reason to be anywhere else. The music box patron came through last week, he said. Collected it, paid well. I've got 3 new commissions and a grandfather clock that needs its escapement replaced. The cam follower tool is still on the secondary bench. I know where it is, she said. He stepped back from the door, and she came inside. He put water on for tea. She sat at the bench and picked up the first item in the commission queue, a barometer with a cracked Borden tube, and held it up to the light the way you hold a thing when you are trying to understand what it is supposed to do and what it is doing instead. Then she asked him the question she always asked, the question that was the beginning of all the work. What's it supposed to do, and what is it doing instead? He answered it as he always did, specifically and without rushing. Outside, the pass road was clear, and the mountain was enormous and patient above it, and the lamp above the workshop door burned in the morning, visible for half a mile in either direction, the way it always had, because Graven was the only crossing for 40 miles and sometimes travelers came through who needed to see a light. Some of them stayed,